Welcome to St. Matthew's Cathedral, everyone. Hey, thank you very much for coming. My name is Chris Evans. I am the Dean here at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and I'm excited to be a part of the Anglican Poetics project. It's very exciting to have everyone be a part of this and for St. Matthew's to be brought in on this project. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we are all treaty people. We are on Treaty 2. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Cree, Dakota, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, and Métis peoples, nations who have sought to walk gently on this land. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one rooted in and based on honor and deep respect. At this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Ryan Turnbull from St. John's College.
Thanks everybody for coming out. So this project is the result of a grant that the Diocese of Rupert's Land received from the Calvin Institute for Vital Worship, Vital Preaching. And for those of you who are from churches who might want to do something around reinvigorating your worship or your preaching, come talk to me about this grant because it's a really great way to get some money to do some cool stuff. But what this grant is funding is a whole year-long project that we're calling the Anglican Poetics Project. What we've been doing is like a series of poetry writing workshops. We're running a class on John Donne and the Bible. We're doing this lecture series. We've got a conference coming up this weekend with a renowned poet who's going to be coming in and doing a whole bunch of stuff with us. And all of this is circling around this idea that was expressed to me early on when I joined the Anglican Church, which is that the Anglican Church doesn't really have a kind of a major Reformation theologian that everybody kind of goes to in the way that people might think of like John Calvin or Martin Luther. Instead, what we have is this prayer book that has this beautiful poetic language and largely is built around the Psalms. And somebody said to me, Anglicanism doesn't have theologians, we have poets. And it has been the case that many of our greatest theologians have either just been poets or have been theologians who also write a lot of great poetry. And that continues to be true today. So what we're trying to get at in this project is what is this kind of poetic sensibility that seems to be recurring in the Anglican tradition, and how can we learn from this tradition and kind of use that to kind of reinvigorate our worshiping life today. Thank you so much to Dr. Paul Dick, who's here today, and who I think taught most of the room here this evening, for helping me so much in putting this lecture series together. I don't know the kinds of people who could speak to this topic, but Paul does. And so Paul reached out to his many contacts, and we have this really great lineup. If you're interested in watching more of them, we are recording all of them, and we'll be, posting those on our website. Or if you really want to make the trek into Winnipeg for a few more, you can check out the poster at the back for that. But tonight's speaker is somebody from Brandon University. Dr. Deanna Smid is professor of English at Brandon University. Dr. Smid holds a doctorate from McMaster University and is the author of a number of plays and essays and of a scholarly monograph entitled The Imagination in Early Modern English Literature. In 2019, Dr. Smid received a Shirk Insight Grant to explore the figure of the humble bee as a symbol of climate change in both Renaissance and contemporary literature. And over dinner this evening, Dr. Smid shared that is about to come to culmination in a book project all about bees that will be out sometime next year, perhaps? Yep, it's being submitted in 2 weeks. So very exciting for that. And for tonight's lecture, we are going to get to hear a little bit about this Anglican poet named Henry Vaughn. And this is some work that came out of Dr. Smid's doctoral work, but as so often happens in these kinds of projects, you have to leave something on the floor. So Dr. Smid has picked that up for us and is going to deliver that this evening. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Deanna Smid.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you for everyone who's here tonight. I'm really excited to get back to Henry Vaughn, to talk more about his poetics, and to talk about hope. That's the title of my talk today, Henry Vaughn and the Poetics of Hope. And just writing this talk made me excited and happy. And I hope that that feeling infects all of you tonight as well. So this is Henry Vaughn. He was born in 1622 in Newton-upon-Usk, and he had little reason to hope. His early life followed a similar trajectory to many young, moderately wealthy men of the gentry class. He and his twin brother Thomas both attended school as boys, and both went to Oxford. Henry likely went on to study law and was a judge's clerk for a few years. Then, in 1642, the English Civil War broke out. Vaughan was an ardent royalist, and he fought on the losing side of the war with King Charles I. With the royalists defeated, Charles I in exile, Vaughan found himself in an England that must have seemed foreign and certainly hopeless. The monarchy was over, but even worse than that, the Church of England was fundamentally altered, even closed for business. If Vaughan had political aspirations, they were now impossible. He could no longer worship in his local church, and the Book of Common Prayer was banned. Vaughan left London and returned to his hometown, a tiny backwater town in the countryside of Wales, and practiced as a country doctor, which was certainly not a high position at the time. With no king, no church, no sacred ceremonies, and no ambition, where was his hope? I'm going to suggest two forms of comfort for Vaughan. The first is poetry, his own, of course, but more importantly, the work of other Anglican poets. Secondly, Vaughan finds comfort in nature. In both instances, however, Vaughan cannot generate hope on his own. His reading and his seeing must be altered by God. For Vaughan, I will argue, hope is not an expression of the will, but a form of submission and humility, and it must transform into action. Vaughan's most famous book of poetry is Sylex Scintillans, which he published in 1650, and then again with some major changes in 1655. In the preface to the 1655 edition, Vaughan makes it clear that his poetry will not partake of the idle words and soul-killing issue generated by other poets seeking fame. His poetry, in contrast, has a different aim, in the vein of Vaughan's poetic hero, and my poetic hero too, George Herbert. The first, Vaughan writes, that with any effectual success attempted a diversion of this foul and overwhelming stream, that's the bad poetry that Vaughan decries, was the blessed man, Mr. George Herbert, whose holy life and verse gained many pious converts, of whom I am the least, and gave the first check to a most flourishing and admired wit of his time. Indeed, Vaughan mirrors Sylex Scintillans on George Herbert's book of poetry, The Temple, imitating many of Herbert's poems and mirroring the layout of the poetry of The Temple. His admiration and imitation of George Herbert gave Vaughan a number of hope-filled advantages. By imitating The Temple, Vaughan recovers and remembers an Anglican poetics, but he also metaphorically reopens the church buildings closed under Puritan parliamentary rule. Herbert's The Temple opens with an extended poem entitled The Church Porch, and the majority of the subsequent poems detail the furnishings of a church building and the holy days of the Anglican calendar. Recreating Herbert's poetry, then, is a reclamation of the Church of England, its texts, its buildings, and even its chattel. In Sylex Scintillans, however, something remarkable happens to Herbert's poem, The Church Porch. For Herbert, the church porch adjured his readers to purify their bodies and souls before entering the church, the physical building, the collection of poetry, and even the holiness of God's presence. The poem, Herbert's poem, is written as a series of commands in the imperative second person. Vaughan places the poem he models after the church porch, entitled Rules and Lessons, in the center of his collection of poetry. And for someone like me, moving a poem from the beginning to the center, this is wild, totally wild. So how could this happen? This, being in the center of the poem, is a suggestive location, noticed by other Vaughn scholars as well. Lewis Martz notes, Vaughn places his advice for daily living exactly in the middle of his book, 24 stanzas, one for every hour of the day. In the rest of his text, in Silence Scintillans, Vaughn is careful to imitate Herbert as closely as possible, so his completely different placement of rules and lessons demands attention. Why does Vaughn, especially in non-imitation of Herbert, place his poem of rules and commands in the center rather than at the beginning of his poetry? Inquiring minds want to know. Of course, when Vaughn was writing his poems, the state of the church was very different than it was when Herbert was writing. For Herbert, the Church of England was secure, the Book of Common Prayer was in regular use, and church buildings were recognizable as belonging to the Church of England. When Vaughn was writing, however, much of that security was completely gone. The Church of England was disestablished, the Book of Common Prayer no longer in liturgical use. Herbert was preparing his readers to walk into a church building, an Anglican church building, but Vaughn can't do that because parish churches were either closed or stripped of their furnishings. Moreover, the new title of the poem, Rules and Lessons, seems to me to be a clear gesture towards the Book of Common Prayer. Under parliamentary rule, the Book of Common Prayer was banned, so perhaps Vaughn is trying to bury it in the middle of his book of poetry. Or, now his poem, in homage to the Book of Common Prayer, is literally central to his poetic endeavor, and every poem in Silence Scintillans revolves around it. The nature of imagination in 17th century England may also explain why Rules and Lessons is in the middle of Silence Scintillans. At the time, the imagination was thought to be a physical organ in the brain, as in, if you dissected somebody's brain, you could find an organ, not unlike a kidney or a liver, called the imagination. That organ was located right in the middle of the head, nestled between the common sense in the front and the memory in the back. So, the placement of Rules and Lessons in the middle of Silence Scintillans emphasizes the necessity of imagination for Vaughn, his readers, and all distraught Anglicans. The Book of Common Prayer was no longer a physical, stable, or comfortable artifact to Vaughn, one that he could read, touch, smell, and hear with his senses, as could Herbert, but rather one that, out of necessity, lived and grew in his and his readers' imagination, in the middle of their brains. Therefore, in order to emphasize the new imaginative quality of his and his readers' interactions with the Book of Common Prayer, Vaughn places Rules and Lessons in the center of his book of poetry, in the place of imagination, instead of at the beginning of Silence Scintillans, reflecting a different church situation from the one Herbert experienced when he was able to place the church porch at the beginning of the temple. Vaughn then turns to poetry for his comfort, for his hope. That poetry yearns for a recent, peaceful past. It reconstructs the church that must have seemed lost to Vaughn, and it models itself after another piece of lost writing, the Book of Common Prayer. Rules and Lessons is certainly not the most famous or anthologized poem of Vaughn's collection, not at all. I'd like to spend more time with it, though, to see how Vaughn pays tribute to the Book of Common Prayer and reimagines the world around him. And when I started working on this talk, I certainly did not think that I would be bringing in Rules and Lessons for us to read together. This is not the poem that usually appears in anthologies. It's not the one that Vaughn is most well known for. But I think there's real value in reading it together and seeing how Vaughn is recreating this poetic sensibility and also how he's looking at the natural world. So please read with me Rules and Lessons, which is on the handout that you all hopefully have. All right, the numbers that I've added to Rules and Lessons are mine. Okay, so I have added these numbers to emphasize that there are 24 stanzas. And those 24 stanzas represent the 24 hours in a day, which is one of the central tropes of the poem. For every hour, there is a stanza. Every part of the day, Vaughn goes through how we should behave and how we should situate ourselves in nature and in relation to God. So, the first stanza. When first thy eyes unveil, give thy soul leave to do the like. Our bodies but forerun the Spirit's duty. True hearts spread and heave unto their God, as flowers do to the sun. Give him thy first thoughts then, so shalt thou keep him company all day, and in him sleep. This is essentially an introductory paragraph to the entire poem. This is the sort of thing I ask my students to do when they're writing essays. Give us a sense of what you are going to be arguing and getting at in your essay. So, Vaughn's first paragraph, or first stanza, the first hour of the day, has us opening our eyes and immediately taking our true hearts and heaving them unto God. We then know from the ends of the stanza that we are going to be doing this for the rest of the day. So shalt thou keep him company all day, and in him sleep. Once we get to the final stanzas, we'll see that moment of sleep. This is also the only time in the poem that Vaughn uses the pronoun our. Everything else in the poem is in the second person, speaking directly to his reader. But he includes himself, and perhaps all people, our bodies, but forerun the Spirit's duty. So this is not just our speaker telling us how to live, right? He is included as well. And I also wanted to give a note on the word thy. When first thy eyes unveil. When Vaughn is writing, thy still means a singular person. And not just a singular person with whom you would have an intimate relationship. So maybe a child, a friend, not someone who is distant from you, higher than you, someone that you are speaking to with affection, with appreciation, right? So singular, but also as a friend, as a confidant. So that's who we are. That's who we are as readers in this poem, right? Vaughn is talking to us, just one of us, and speaking to us as a friend. Now, if we move on to stanza 2. Yet, never sleep the sun up. He is not letting us sleep in, alas. Prayer should dawn with the day. There are set awful hours twixt heaven and sun. The manna was not good after sun rising. Far day sullies flowers. Rise to prevent the sun. Sleep doth sin's glut, and heaven's gate opens when this world's is shut. This stanza emphasizes the two main sources that Vaughn uses in this poem, Rules and Lessons. One source is, of course, the Bible. His reference to manna would have been recognizable, of course, to anyone with knowledge of the Bible. His other source is nature. The sun, after sun rising, far day sullies flowers. So why should we be most productive right when we wake up? That's because that's when flowers are at their best, right? The heat of the day, the power of the sun sullies flowers. So like them, and like manna, we need to do our work before the day ruins us, essentially. Now, I find stanza 3 quite remarkable, particularly for its first lines. Walk with thy fellow creatures. Note the hush and whispers amongst them. There's not a spring or leaf but hath his morning hymn. Each bush and oak doth know I am. Canst thou not sing? Oh, leave thy cares and follies, go this way, and thou art sure to prosper all the day. Take a look at that word, fellow creatures. Vaughn is not limiting fellow creatures to other people, to other humans. he's also not limiting fellow creatures to other animals. Fellow creatures here are a spring, a leaf, a bush, and an oak. He is seeing his fellow creatures in the vegetation, even the water sources around him. Right? And that is quite remarkable, I think, especially at a time where we often very much separate ourselves as humans from animals and certainly from plants and springs. But to Vaughn, they are fellow creatures. Stanza 4. Serve God before the world. Let him not go until thou hast a blessing. Then resign the whole unto him. And remember who prevailed by wrestling ere the sun did shine. Pour oil upon the stones, weep for thy sin, then journey on and have an eye to heaven. That last line, then journey on and have an eye to heaven. Vaughn is not just creating 24 hours of a day where every hour is devoted to God. We're also on a journey, which sounds really trite when I say it like that, but Vaughn does it well. Right? This is not just a day. This is a voyage where we are moving somewhere. So we have another layer here to the complexity of the poem. Every hour has its own stanza, but we're not just passing time, right? We are also moving forward with an eye to heaven. The metaphor is expanded even more in stanza 5. Mornings are mystery, the first world's youth. Now, if I stop just at the first world's youth, now again, we're not just talking about the hours of the day. This is the life cycle of a person. So those early hours, those are youth. This is our childhood, our adolescence. And we'll see as the poem carries on, we get into adulthood very quickly. Stanza 6, in fact. In stanza 6, we start working. Alas, it comes upon us quickly. 5 stanzas to enjoy the morning. Now we're working as adults. Stanza 6 begins, when the world's up and every swarm abroad, keep thou thy temper, mix not with every clay, dispatch necessities. Life hath a load which must be carried on. There's our work, and safely may. Yet keep those cares without thee. Let the heart be God's alone, and choose the better part. Stanza 7 carries on with work. I'm going to move, therefore, to stanza 8. Sometimes we need a break from work. Stanza 8 gives us a reminder of that Civil War context that Vaughn is writing in. To God, thy country, and thy friend be true. If priest and people change, keep thou thy ground. Certainly Vaughn has seen priest and people change. Right? He has seen neighbors killing each other in the parliamentary wars. He has seen priests stripped of their offices. This is very real to Vaughn and his readers. Stanza 9. Seek not the same steps with the crowd. Stick thou to thy sure trot. This life is a trot. We are trotting on our journey. Now, every time I see a line like this that talks about something being kept in time, I can't help but take a look at the poetry itself. Is it keeping time? It is. These 24 stanzas, 6 lines each, are remarkably even in their meter. The poem itself has a sure trot. It does not deviate from its 10 syllables. So it is mirroring the sort of endurance, a slow but steady pace. Wait, is a trot slow? Let's say a medium fast, steady pace as we proceed throughout the day, throughout our lives, and throughout this metaphorical journey that Vaughn is creating. Stanza 10, 11, 12, 13, again, teach us, and not just teach us, command us how to behave in adulthood. In stanza 10, we are told, be honest. Again, Vaughn says this so much better than I. Stanza 11, we should give to the poor. Stanza 12, we must speak well of others. In stanza 13, we are not allowed to take delight in lewdness and sin. In stanza 14, we are to enjoy our friends. Stanza 15 brings us back to Vaughn looking at nature. And he spends 4 lines talking about the way that we look at the world around us. And those 4 lines will carry on into stanza 16 as well. So I'm going to read those 2 stanzas aloud. To heighten thy devotions and keep low all mutinous thoughts, what business e'er thou hast, observe God in his works. Here fountains flow, birds sing, beasts feed, fish leap, and the earth stands fast. Above are restless motions, running lights, vast circling azure, giddy clouds, days, nights. We are to observe God. And how do we do that? By looking at his works. And for Vaughn, those works are most apparent in the nature around him. Now, if you attend next week's lecture, you're going to hear a lot about ecology in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Is that right? Yes. But we're getting a little taste right now of this Anglican poet looking at the world around him, finding God. Same with stanza 16. When seasons change, and we've added another layer to this vast array of tropes and metaphors that Vaughn is creating. Now, not only is the day progressing, not only is someone's life moving from childhood to adulthood, now we also have changing seasons, right? So when you are young, that is the springtime of your life. When you're an adult, it's the summer. As you get older, we move into the fall and winter. Alas, winter. That's where we're old and almost gone. So, stanza 16. When seasons change, then lay before thine eyes his wondrous method. Mark the various scenes in heaven, hail, thunder, rainbows, snow, and ice, calms, tempests, light, and darkness by his means. Thou canst not miss his praise. Each tree, herb, flower are shadows of his wisdom and his power. I also find it noteworthy that in stanzas 15 and 16, Vaughn gives us lists, long lists compared to the rest of the poem, of the things that he observes in nature that bring him closer to God. So as he observes God in his works, he gives us a fairly lengthy list of all the things that he sees. In stanza 16 as well, we have hail and thunder and rainbows and snow and ice, and he carries on. So there is so much to see, so much variety as well that nature shows to us, or that we see as we look at nature. Stanza 17. To meals when thou dost come, give him the praise, whose arm supplied thee. Take what may suffice, and then be thankful. Oh, admire his ways, who fills the world's unemptied granaries. A thankless feeder is a thief, his feast a very robbery, and himself no guest. Keep that unemptied granaries in the back of your minds, because we're going to get back to them, but I don't want to give it away. So hold on. Stanza 18, we're getting older. The day is getting later. The seasons are changing. High noon, thus past, thy time decays. Right? This life described in the poem is getting shorter. Time decays. And that decay continues as the poem gets closer and closer to its conclusion. Stanza 19, we see again the reference to light that often imbues Vaughn's poetry. And again, the reference to the season. Man is a summer's day, whose youth and fire cool to a glorious evening and expire. At this point, we're getting more and more hints of death. We have decay in stanza 18. Now we have expire in stanza 19. We all know what's coming. When night comes, starts stanza 20, list thy deeds and make plain the way twixt heaven and thee. Block it not with delays, but perfect all before thou sleepest. Then say, there's one sun more strung on my bead of days. What's good, score up for joy. The bad well scanned, wash off with tears, and get thy master's hand. Stanza 21 tells us, do not fear death. In fact, lie in a tomb to get yourself ready. Stanza 22 and 23 as well. For Vaughn, in this poem, death does not end in darkness. I actually find very similar imagery in these two stanzas, 22 and 23, to Dylan Thomas's poem, Rage, Rage Against the Dying of the Light. That, however, is the topic for another talk. And let's get finally to stanza 24, right? His final stanza in this expansive metaphorical day, season, journey. Here we are. Briefly. I love it when someone ends a long poem with the word briefly. Vaughn has been anything but brief. But here we are. Briefly, do as thou wouldst be done unto. Love God and love thy neighbor. Watch and pray. These are the words and works of life. This do and live. Who doth not thus hath lost heaven's way. Oh, lose it not. Look up. We're still looking at the end of the poem. Our eyes still have to be open. Look up. Wilt change those lights for chains of darkness and eternal nights? So our poem ends with a series of, what would we call them? Biblical adages, right? Do as thou wouldst be done unto. Love God, love thy neighbor, watch and pray. Familiar words, words of comfort, followed with that command, look up. Don't stop looking. Now, I found rules and lessons helpful for my talk tonight because it brings together two of Vaughn's sources of hope. Poetry, whether he finds it in Herbert, the Book of Common Prayer, or the Bible itself, and nature. His poems are marked by an emphasis on solitude and the natural world, inspiring some critics to consider him a proto-romanticist. One modern biographer of Vaughn writes, at the beginning of the 21st century, some students of environmental literature consider it anachronistic to think of ecological consciousness as anything but a post-Darwinian phenomenon. Closer study of Vaughn might convince them otherwise. Yes, the master of understatement. Some of Vaughn's currently popular poetry, such as Regeneration, which we will get to, describes the poet walking abroad in high spring and finding God's voice in the hush of creation. Yet even a didactic poem like Rules and Lessons, buried in the middle of Silent Scintillans, emphasizes Vaughn's fascination with the natural world. Many of the overarching structures of England are gone. The Church of England, the monarchy. So Vaughan finds hope and purpose in every hour of the day and in the seemingly mundane, common elements of the world around him. There is another fly in the ointment for Vaughn's hope, however, and one that is particularly relevant for us today, I believe. We can certainly, like Vaughn, find hope by looking at the natural world around us, but we'll see some terrible things too. Droughts, disappearing bees. Yes, the bees made it into the talk. Terrible storms and other ravages from climate change. This is hardly, though, the first time that climate has changed alarmingly within recorded human history. From around 1300 to 1850, the world experienced the so-called Little Ice Age, with the coldest temperatures occurring during the Maunder Minimum, which is my new favorite phrase, the Maunder Minimum of 1645 to 1715, which is exactly when Vaughn is writing. Yet Brian Fagan writes that we have forgotten that only 2 centuries ago, Europe, in fact the whole world, experienced a cycle of bitterly cold winters. The arid statistics of temperature and rainfall mean little without the chill of cold on one's skin, or mud clinging to one's boots in a field of ruined wheat flattened by rain. Do you remember those overfilled granaries in Rules and Lessons? Yeah, they were quite scarce during Vaughn's lifetime. Crops were failing, and failing with horrific effect. So during the Little Ice Age, England was also experiencing its first environmental crisis, Randall Martin argues in Shakespeare and Ecology. Because of deforestation, England was running out of timber, and many homes and businesses began burning coal rather than wood as fuel. Burning coal, however, produced more of what we now call air pollution. Martin describes the new environmental consciousness in England during the period thusly. As changing land uses and growing consumption of resources threatened local environments, early modern men and women came to recognize that England's natural bounty of woodland, rivers, and arable soil, hitherto assumed to be unlimited, could no longer be taken for granted. This awareness prompted them to rethink human relationships with nature and take steps to promote it. Language, too, was affected by the changing climate. Robert Markley writes about early modern literature. Shakespeare's language reflects a sensitivity to climate conditions in early modern England that, all but unnoticed by most modern commentators, locates Shakespeare and his contemporaries in a volatile era in climatological history that, in some ways, offers an inverted but potentially instructive image of our own 21st century descent into global warming. Although I'm not sure I would call Henry Vaughn a contemporary of Shakespeare, his poetry is particularly helpful as a response to Markley's call to see inverted but potentially instructive images in climatological literature of early modern England. So Vaughn's appeal to hope in the natural world is all the more remarkable, considering the upheaval in that natural world. So how does Vaughn do it? How does he maintain hope in poetry and in the Book of Common Prayer, now cast aside, and in the natural world, filled with ice, tempests, and failed crops? To Vaughn's speaker, I will argue, hope is not an act of the will. Neither he nor his readers can force themselves to feel hope, even in poetry or the natural world. Rather, in Vaughn's text, hope is an act of submission and surrender. In stanza 15 of Rules and Lessons, we haven't left it behind, the speaker tells us to observe God in his works. But clear and trustworthy senses are therefore vital for Silek Scintillan's and Vaughn's poetry. His first poem exhorts his readers to approach his poetry with repaired senses. If we're going to observe, we have to be able to observe rightly. In Vain Wits and Eyes, the first non-dedicatory poem in his text, Vaughan admits that his senses need repair. He must analyze his senses before he writes any poem, because as Vaughan builds his poetry with visual imagery and other appeals to the senses, his text will be completely ineffective if his and his reader's senses are incapable of processing, of sensing his poetry. In order to prepare himself and his readers for the rest of his poetry, therefore, he begins his collection by adjuring readers to repair their senses by penitence and tears, so that the tears may wash away the filth of the eyes, which will then be able to see the glory of God. I have not given you the text of Vain Wits and Eyes, so you're going to have to trust me on this. The poem begins like this: Vain wits and eyes, leave and be wise. Abuse not, shun not holy fire, but with true tears wash off your mire. The eyes are caked with mud. They are covered in mire. So for Vaughan to carry on with his poetry, and for us as readers to be able to read his poetry, we have to get that mud, that mire, off of our eyes. When the reader's eyes are clean, Vaughan continues, then comes the light, ! Which when you spy and see your nakedness thereby, when you truly see yourself, praise him who dealt his gifts so free, in tears to you, in fire to me. So when the senses are repaired, then people can see their own need for God, and they can also see God's gifts in themselves. Vaughn, however, makes a distinction between his readers and himself, the poet. For the reader's eyes are cleansed by tears, but Vaughn's by fire, which sounds very uncomfortable. Now, tears and fire have similar metaphorical functions in the poem. For as Vaughn writes, tears and these flames will soon grow kind and mix an eye salve for the blind. But one is reserved for Vaughn and the other for the reader. Vaughn's fire is more violent and aggressive than the reader's tears, and is more apparent to an onlooker. The reader's tears allow them to see Vaughn's fire. Vaughn's eyes are purified so that he can write poetry for many to see and experience, but readers' eyes are cleaned so that they can read that poetry. Especially in his first poem, readers must understand rather than create, which Vaughn will be doing in his poetry. Now, Vaughn does not suggest that readers do not have to perform action along with him, rather that the actions of readers and of Vaughn are different. While Vaughn is forming the images that the reader must witness, the act of witnessing is dynamic. For after readers' eyes are cleaned, then their immediate action in response to sight is to praise God. Before readers can respond to the visual stimulation of Vaughn's poetry, the senses, both Vaughn's and readers, must be repaired. And to the devotional poet Vaughn, that repair is accomplished by him, God, who gives gifts of tears to the reader and gifts of fire to the poet. For Vaughn, the ability to have hope, to be humble enough to have hope, to see with eyes that have been given sight by fire, is accomplished through violent means. The title of the book of poetry, Silex Scintillans, means flashing flint, likely alluding to the images of light that Vaughn includes throughout his poetry. But the frontispiece of the first edition of Silex Scintillans, this one published in 1650, demonstrates that producing light and even seeing light is a painful process. And that frontispiece you have in your handout. And if you take a look at the image, you can see a heart made out of flint. And it is being struck by this hand reaching out of the clouds with lightning or a staff. And as it's being struck, it is producing those flames of fire and tears at the same time. Now, that hand, more than likely, is the hand of God. But God cannot be represented in full form, particularly in a Puritan society. Now, what we have here with this image is an emblem. An emblem is a literary genre that was hugely popular in the 17th century, but has largely faded away. Has anyone heard of emblems before? Ha! 1, 2, wonderful. Emblems were commonly composed of 3 elements: a motto, or the title of the emblem, a pictura, an engraving of a highly metaphorical image, and an epigram, an explanation of what the pictura actually means. Here at the beginning of Vaughn's book of poetry, we have all 3 elements. The motto is the title of the book, Silex Scintillans, or Flashing Flint. The pictura you have before you, and the epigram is the following poem, in Latin in the original, but in translation on your sheet. If we weren't sure that the picture is an emblem, the title of the poem gives it away, the author's emblem concerning himself. And here's the translation of what is likely far more beautiful in Latin. You have often touched me, I confess, without a wound, and your voice, without a voice, has often sought to counsel me. Your diviner breath has encompassed me with its calm motion, and in vain has cautioned me with its sacred murmur. I was deaf and dumb, a flint. You, how great care you take of your own, try to revive another way. You change the remedy, and now angered, you say that love has no power, and you prepare to conquer force with force. You come closer, You break through the rocky barrier of my heart, and it is made flesh that was before a stone. Behold me torn asunder, and at last with tears out of the adamant. And adamant was a very, very hard substance. Thus, once upon a time, you made the rocks flow and the crags gush, as ever provident of your people. How marvelous toward me is your hand. In dying, I have been born again, and in the midst of my shattered means, I am now richer. In the poem, Vaughn reveals that he had to be broken before he could be rich. He had to be struck down by God before he could hear God's voice, before he could find hope in words or nature. Again, to Vaughn's poet, hope is humility. Once Vaughn's speaker is paradoxically beaten down into having hope, then he can hear the quiet whisper of God's voice. I could not help myself but include what is probably Vaughn's most famous poem, and that's Regeneration, which you have on your handout. I invite you to read this entire poem at your leisure because it is gorgeous. But let's take a look at one of the final stanzas in this poem. Stanza 10. Our speaker has been walking through nature and has noticed a fountain, has noticed plants and flowers, but he's looking for God. He is listening for God. And finally, in stanza 10, we find him. I turned me round, and to each shade dispatched an eye, to see if any leaf had made least motion or reply. But while I listening sought my mind to ease by knowing where 'twas or where not, it whispered, where I please. The voice of God here is a whisper, where I please. Lord, then said I, on me one breath, and let me die before my death. According to the opening emblem, the poet shouldn't be able to hear the quiet whisper of God's voice. But God has forced hope upon him and has purified his senses with fire so that he can see and hear God and his comfort in poetry and in nature. But finally, Vaughn's hope doesn't end there. He has had hope thrust upon him, and now he can see it in the world around him, even in the mundane tasks of everyday life. But he has to share that hope. Particular evidence of Vaughn prioritizing sharing his hope is in the second edition of Silent Scintillans, published in 1655. The book is still subtitled Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations, which might imply that Vaughn's poems are indeed private and personal. This time, however, Vaughn specifically calls the second half of the book hymns. The second edition of Silent Scintillans is divided into two books. The second book has a preface called The Author's Preface to the Following Hymns. Poems were often called songs in the 17th century, but hymns has a different connotation. A hymn is to be sung communally. The poet is not singing to himself. He is inviting his readers to sing with him. Moreover, in the second edition of Silent Scintillans, something is missing. The pictura of the opening emblem, that beautiful image, that engraving, it's gone. The book still contains the text of the author's emblem, but the engraving with the heart-shaped flint being struck by God's hand, not present. Does that mean that Vaughn no longer needs God's violent hand to fill his eyes and ears with hope? I don't think so. More likely, Vaughn would find it easier to get his poetry published if the image were gone. Puritan Parliament controlled the printing presses, and Puritans were generally opposed to images used in devotional contexts. With the image gone, Vaughn was more likely to find a publisher and more likely to be able to share his hope. With the book published, Vaughn can contribute to the poetics that gave him hope. He can demonstrate to his readers how to find hope in fountains, birds, beasts, fish, and the earth. He can document the force that humbled him into having hope at all. After all, what good is flashing flint if no one can see it? What good is flashing flint if it lights no fires?
thank you so much. We have some time for some questions, but it's very important that we use this microphone so that we can get that into the recording. So, are there any questions for Dr. Smid?
Yeah. Thank you for this wonderful talk. And I'm wondering, so Herbert with the church porch is giving the young person instructions like how to behave yourself in church. And so this is really fascinating that Rules and Lessons is coming now in the center of this collection. Is this, I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, I mean, is it that this discipline, this kind of, personal discipline is now kind of taking the role of what would otherwise go on in church more regularly, and that's why it's got to be central. Like it, in Herbert, it's like you learn the lessons and then you enter the sacred space of the church and you know how to behave yourself. But here it's doing a different kind of work, right? Yeah.
No, thank you. That is a lovely question. I think we could definitely see Silex Scintillans as a whole as the church having to permeate every aspect of life, because Vaughn was not able to attend the church that he recognized, the church that he loved. I believe the parish church in his town was closed down during these years. So without being able to focus that worship on Sundays, he expands it. So now all of life, even waking up in the morning, looking at the world around him, walking through a grove, all of that becomes an act of worship and becomes devotional in a way that's similar to how he would have behaved in church. So moving that poem to the center, right, may emphasize, right, that the church has not necessarily been displaced. It's actually become more central to someone like Vaughn, and it has now expanded into places where it always was, but maybe not to the same degree and focus and attention that Vaughn is giving it in Silex Scintillans. Thank you, that's cool.
Thank you. When you talked about the emblem and the symbols, is that a lot of the noble houses also, they always had their little crest thing with? It's the same setup, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very similar. And emblems, particularly as they filtered into emblem literature, were very much influenced by heraldry, by crests. Emblems in emblem books were a very, very specific, very didactic, but also sometimes hilarious form of literature. And I'm very sad that it's not as popular as it once was. But yes, very much created in imitation of heraldry. And what's kind of neat is that emblems from books ended up also being painted on people's walls, like in their homes, being embroidered on tapestries, even placed on gravestones.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, so they kind of went back to where they came from, right? Starting in heraldry and other things, of course, moving into books and then moving back into a sort of applied world.
Oh, thank you.
I just have a quick, fairly easy question for the emblem. Is that, it seems to me that it's based very much on the altar by Herbert. Would that be correct? I mean, it's the same metaphor from Ezekiel.
Yeah.
And then I was also wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, I'm seeing, I think you mentioned in your talk how there's some people have found romanticism in Vaughn, and it seems to me that it is there, some forerunners of romanticism, maybe not pantheism, but almost a forerunner as well of that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more. Maybe it's not your area of expertise, but sort of where that originates and where we distinguish between the two, maybe.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You're allowing me to touch on something that I completely avoided in my talk, kind of on purpose, but I was hoping someone would ask. So if we're talking about the potential origin of Vaughn's insistence that God can be found all through the natural world, can be found in text, is sort of imbued throughout life. One potential origin is Hermeticism. His twin brother Thomas was a very well-established Hermetic and wrote a number of Hermetic texts. And some scholars of Vaughn, both Henry and Thomas, have looked at Thomas and his Hermeticism and then applied that to Henry and said, we can see Hermeticism throughout Henry Vaughn's poetry. And where that becomes quite significant for Vaughn's poetry is the emphasis on light, because light is really important in Hermetic philosophy, and also in the unfallenness of nature. So some Hermetics, and Thomas included, believe that in the fall, only humanity fell, but nature did not. So and this is a big if, which is why I left it out of the paper, if we assume that Henry shared his brother's philosophies, then perhaps we're seeing the perfection of nature, that it has not fallen along with the rest, with us, essentially. So I've avoided your romanticism question, but you let me get Hermeticism in.
That's really interesting. And now I'm wondering if... What am I thinking? It sometimes seems to me that right now we often have a similar impulse where, in relation to the ecological crisis, we sort of have that same impulse where, in secular terms, we'll speak of a fallen humanity and a perfect divine nature. So that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I've been interested in the connection between Herbert's poetry and the new science.
Okay.
And so I was curious in the first poem, stanza 15, there's an image of the stationary Earth. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking, is Vaughn not taking on the kind of Copernican revolution where he still has the Earth as standing still and the heavens revolving around it? And then I guess another question that's a bit unrelated, but your culminating point on hope as something that's not found in poetry and in nature in a sort of direct way, but you need this kind of apocalyptic intervention. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is that kind of connected to this idea of the ecological crisis, so nature is not accessible, the church is not accessible either, but I'm sort of then wondering, how does one achieve hope? Do you sort of just sit around waiting for a kind of apocalyptic breakthrough, or how does one cultivate hope or achieve hope? Is it sort of just arbitrary, or you kind of just have to receive it?
Yeah, that is the tough question. Vaughn is in many respects powerless. If hope is something that is an act of God working violently upon him, he doesn't have the capacity to say, make me yours, right? God comes to him first. So does he just have to kind of wait around? That's a good question. I think that's why that emblem comes first in the poem. We don't see any of that waiting around. It has happened. It has happened already. And because it has happened, Vaughn can move on and continue, or he has the capacity now to find hope. So without that divine intervention at the very beginning, hope would be impossible for Vaughn. But how to get that divine intervention, that he doesn't spell out for us. I'm sorry, that is a very unsatisfactory answer.
Does he see as poetry as in some way does he see as poetry as in any way like a medium for the divine breakthrough? Is he hoping that somehow someone could be reading his poetry and then that's a way that God can, strike his flint upon the heart?
Well, perhaps that's what's happened to Vaughn with his reading of Herbert. Right? He talks about Herbert as being this esteemed, wonderful person that has made him a convert. So Vaughn places his own belief in God as a conversion that was accomplished through the poetry of George Herbert. So if we push that to its extreme, then yes, it could indeed be poetry that is that push towards conversion, that at least positions the heart where God will then work upon it to allow hope to enter. I'm thinking along with this, so thank you. Oh, and then you had a question about the new science. That is a tough one. I don't know what Vaughn all read. He was a prolific translator, and he was a doctor, but likely unlicensed. Certainly he could have seen some reference to new science in Herbert, because I do think that Herbert has a lot more science in him than we often acknowledge. But Vaughn's own knowledge, I'm afraid I don't know. But thank you.
So it seems to me that there is an inversion of Psalm 19 here, where God has the voiceless voice, and it's wandering in nature that he hears a voice. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder, what you think about that inversion and what's he doing with that?
Where God is voiceless, essentially.
Yeah, because Psalm 19, it's the heavens, it's the natural world that spews forth speech but voicelessly.
Yeah.
And then in the law, right, that's where we encounter the real voice of God. But Vaughn has inverted that in these two poems that you've shared, right? And so, what do you think he's doing with that?
Oh, trying to get into Vaughn's head. That's always an exciting and terrifying prospect. Yeah, there is some weird stuff going on with who can speak and also who can hear. Because speaking is one thing, but if you can't hear it, then the voice itself is ineffective. So I'm thinking of the emblem again, where in our translation there, Vaughn begins, "You have often touched me, I confess, without a wound, and your voice, without a voice, has often sought to counsel me." So, of course, as a metaphysical poet, Vaughn loves paradoxes. So this paradox of God having a voice and counseling Vaughn, but without a voice, is of course a paradox that would be fairly familiar to this sort of poetry. Even "you have touched me without a wound," right? How is that possible? But Vaughn, hearing the word of God, not in the law, but in these quiet murmurs, it does reappear throughout Thylic Scintillans, where he can only hear God by being very, very quiet. And even then, God's voice is very brief in every poem, but the brevity is enough. He doesn't need to hear a recitation of the law. He doesn't need to hear anything beyond the voice itself. So even in Regeneration, where the voice whispers, "Where I please." It's answering a question that Vaughn hasn't even completely asked with his own voice. To be honest, I have no idea where this answer is going, beyond saying that God's voice and voicelessness, along with people having to be able to hear that voice, is certainly interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Is there any last questions?
I'm thinking about, you said he's kind of modeled after Herbert's The Temple, and so I was thinking about there, and what stuck out to me in Herbert, I was thinking about Job a lot. The kind of crying out to God and wanting to hear an answer, but I'm wondering if there's any of this similar kind of wrestling in Vaughn, where, yeah, the thing in Herbert is often you have the speaker saying like, God isn't listening, but at the end it's like this, oh, the speaker was the one who wasn't hearing, and things like that. And then the resolution, obviously, of that, where the speaker finally submits or surrenders and allows himself to sit down at the table, I guess. So I'm wondering if there's like how that shows up in Vaughn, this kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows up, I think, particularly in Regeneration, the final poem that we talked about very briefly. This similar sort of a poem, the poet is searching for God, for the presence of God. I'm not even sure if the poet realizes, or the speaker realizes, that he's looking for the voice of God. But that's what he gets. Very, very briefly, very quietly, very similar to how in many of Herbert's poems, the speaker spends so much work trying to find God. It goes from town to town, seeks high and low, or in the Caller is crying out to God in anger. And then God replies, sometimes without words at all. And then it's over. The searching is over. The speaker leaves at peace. And that a very similar thing happens in Regeneration. So our speaker in stanza 10 hears that whisper, "Where I please," and then the poem's basically over. We then have 2 lines rather than a complete stanza. "Lord, then said I, on me one breath, and let me die before my death." And that's it, right? He has found peace, and found peace dying with his Lord. So yes, I think a very, very similar movement and comfort to what we see in a lot of Herbert's poetry, right? This busyness of trying to find God, and God can calm that busyness and does calm it with a single word or simply with his presence. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful. Let's give Dr. Smid another round of applause. So speaking of emblems, Seika Dick, who is Paul's daughter, has created a series of stamps for this series, one for every church that we go to along the way. So at the back, as you came in, there was a little table with some paper and stuff on it. There is a stamp there for St. Matthew's this evening. So if you want an emblem of this evening's events, feel free to make yourself a little stamp. There's some cardstock there at the back. And thank you all so much for coming. This has been